Kjære alle sammen, velkommen til Fritt Ord og dette frokostseminar om journalistikkens status i Norge og 37 andre land. This event takes place in partnership with the Reuters Institute for the study of journalism at Oxford University, and Richard Fletcher is here to present the international report, which is made public globally this morning. Special welcome to you. Also welcome to Professor Hallvard Moe from the University of Bergen, responsible for the Norwegian version of the report and the more detailed Norwegian analysis to be found there. Very grateful for that contribution. The Fritt Ord Foundation has a good and long-term cooperation with the Reuters Institute, co-funding a little bit of its research, and every year we send one Norwegian journalist or editor to Oxford to work on a project for half a year with a scholarship, and we welcome more applicants. Thea Elnan is this year's fellow. Richard Fletcher's introduction will be in English, and then the main parts of this seminar in Norwegian. But of course, at any time during the event, you are welcome to ask Richard questions in English. Det å støtte uavhengig journalistikk som spiller en rolle i samfunnet et av de viktigste områdene for Stiftelsen Fritt Ord. Høsten 2017 lanserte vi et utvidet journalistikkprogram kalt Norsk journalistikk, rett og slett, fordi det helt åpent. Vi gir støtte til det redaksjoner og journalister interessert i, uten å definere felter selv. Vi har satt av 100 millioner kroner over 4 år, og det 6 søknadsfrister hvert år. Journalistikken befinner seg jo fortsatt i en krevende og utfordrende situasjon. Det beste av journalistikk som blir skapt i dag nok bedre og mer profesjonell enn noen gang, som vi pleier å si. Men samtidig ser vi at det ennå store problemer med å finansiere den. Globale teknologiaktører som ikke produserer journalistikk selv overtar det meste av annonseinntektene, og brukerbetalingen monner fortsatt ikke nok til å kompensere, selv om det begynner å hjelpe litt. Det spørs imidlertid om mediestøttemeldingen som ble vedtatt i Stortinget i går vil gjøre det helt store til eller fra, men den vel ingen katastrofe. Midt oppi alt dette sliter journalistikken med borgernes tillit, og kampanjer, politisk motiverte angrep forsøker å svekke den ytterligere. Og nettopp en variant av det spørsmålet, hva slags medier vi har tillit til, ett tema her i dag. Og i denne situasjonen trenger vi politisk kunnskap om journalistikkens status og brukernes forhold til journalistikken. Det gir Digital News Report fra Reuters Institute oss, konkrete fakta og innsikter, tosiders grafiske oppsett som morsomt å lese og lett å sammenligne, på tvers altså av 38 land nå. Et av de globale resultatene i år at flere mediebrukere legger større vekt på å søke pålitelige mediekilder, og særlig ser vi dette klart i USA. Men vi ser også en økning i antallet nyhetsunnvikere som ikke orker mer av dårlige nyheter som de ikke kan gjøre noe med. For å skifte fokus til Norge nå, en bevilgning fra Fritt Ord gjorde at Norge for 4 år siden kunne inkluderes i rapporten, og de siste årene har vi altså også fått medieforskere ved Universitetet i Bergen til å lage en liten analyse av de norske resultatene på norsk, i den nødtøftige, nøkterne, men delikate lille publikasjonen som finnes utenfor her. Det ikke store endringer fra i fjor. Norge fortsatt landet med høyest betalingsvilje for nettnyheter. Det synes å være en stabil tillit til nyhetene, men jeg merker meg at undersøkelsens fakta ble samlet inn før den store VG-Giske-saken. Kanskje Hallvard kan kommentere litt om det. Så stabil tillit til nyhetene, men flere har et mindre aktivt forhold til nyhetene. Vi deler mindre. Kanskje kan det ha med bekymringen for upålitelige nyheter å gjøre, jeg vet ikke. Men alt dette skal vi høre mer om og diskutere de neste 80 minuttene, frem til klokka 10:30. Vi skal først høre Richard Fletcher fra Oxford University presentere den internasjonale undersøkelsen, så Hallvard Moe med den norske versjonen, og deretter en panelsamtale og med anledning til å ta ordet fra salen også, Den blir ledet av sjefredaktør Erik Våtland i Media24, og i panelet sitter... Du sitter der, Hallvard, ikke sant? Ja, ok. Hege Storhaug, informasjonsansvarlig i Human Rights Service, og Ingeborg Senneset, journalist, forfatter, styremedlem i Norsk Penn, og Pål Hellenes, landstyremedlem i Norsk Journalistlag. So then I have the pleasure of giving the word and the floor to Richard Fletcher from Oxford University. Welcome and please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invite back to Oslo to present the international findings to you once again from the 2019 Digital News Report. This is our 8th report that we've published. There's quite a lot in it, so I'm only just going to give you an overview of what I think some of the most important key findings are. But I do encourage you to look at our website where you can download a full copy of the report for free. I'm afraid I don't have any print copies to hand out today. So some of you may know that this is the largest, we think the largest ongoing survey of news use in the world. This year we surveyed 75,000 people across 38 different markets and 6 continents, because we're very pleased to be able to add South Africa to our list of countries this year, part of our commitment to do more research and understand better the global South. I should say, as I always do, that this is an online poll, so the results are representative of or the sample is representative of the online population in each country. And this means that it will tend to slightly underrepresent TV use, print use, and other forms of traditional news use in some cases. The polling itself was conducted by YouGov on our behalf, and we use sample sizes of around 2,000 people in each country. And we've supplemented our quantitative results this year with a series of in-depth interviews with young people in the US and the UK, and I'll draw on some of those findings as I go through the presentation. You can see at the bottom of this slide, we're very grateful to a wide range of different sponsors, including the Reuters Foundation, which is the core sponsor of the Reuters Institute, and also 14 organizations which help support the production of this report, including Google, the BBC, Ofcom, and a range of other different organizations around the world, including, of course, Fritt Ord, who are organizing this event today. So here are some of the key findings from this year's report. So firstly, we are seeing that more and more people are paying for online news, but it's important to keep in mind that the growth is really limited to a very small number of countries, and within that, a small number of big brands within those countries. And what we're trying to do this year is suggest some of the limits to do with the subscription models that many different publishers are pursuing. Second, we find that concerns around fake news and misinformation do indeed appear to be starting to change people's behavior as people turn more to what they call reputable sources and start avoiding outlets with a poor track record. Despite this, we are seeing continued year-on-year falls in trust in the mainstream media. In particular, people are complaining about the negativity of the mainstream media, but they do think it does a good job on breaking news, but not such a good job on explaining it to people. When it comes to social media, we see that people are spending less time on more open networks like Facebook and more time on slightly more closed networks like Instagram and YouTube, but in particular WhatsApp, as the shift to private messaging picks up pace. And finally, we're interested in audio, and in particular podcasts, which do continue to grow in many countries. And we have some new research, particularly focusing on young people and looking at their motivations for using this particular type of news. So, as many of us will know, the search for sustainable business models for news goes on, as digital advertising revenues continue to disappoint for many publishers, and as they pin their hopes on different types of reader payment. Our data shows some growth this year, but it is focused in a small number of countries. So the US remains on 16%. This is the proportion of people who pay for news of any sort online in the last year, but this has grown 7 percentage points since 2016. The UK has shown a small increase to 9%, But it's really the Nordic countries that lead the world here. So 34% of people in Norway say that they've paid for some form of online news in the last year, an increase of 4 percentage points compared to 2018. And there's also a high figure for Sweden, but this is the exception rather than the rule. If we look at some of the figures for some of the largest European countries, you can see the lines are pretty flat, so around 10% across Germany, France, and Spain. And apart from this bump that we saw after the election of Trump in the US, the lines are pretty flat in most countries. But perhaps more important than this, we can see that even in those countries where there is growth, it tends to be confined to a small number of publishers. So these are industry figures looking at the digital-only subscriptions in the US. And a recent poll showed that over half of all new subscriptions are going to just these three publishers. Going back to our own data, we can also see that people who do subscribe to news organizations tend to be from quite a specific group, so people who are highly educated, have high levels of interest in the news, and are more affluent. And this is backed up in another way. If we look at the people who do pay for news and ask them how many different organizations they've paid money to in the last year, you can see the vast majority of people pay to just one. And this doesn't really change. This is the figure for the whole UK population who pay, but if you just focus on people with high levels of education, people with higher levels of interest, you see a very, very similar pattern. So everyone is chasing this small group of people. Another complication for news organizations that they are now just one of many different businesses who are looking for a subscription from the public. So just in the media space, you have entertainment services like Netflix, audio services like Spotify, sports subscriptions, and also things like online gaming and online dating as well. So what we did is we asked people, if you could have only one subscription for the next year, which one would you choose? Amongst over 45s, perhaps not too bad. 15% say they would have a new subscription if they could only have one. But if you look at the green bars, you can see that entertainment options are still preferred amongst this age group. And for younger groups, the under 45s, it's just 7% who would choose news over any other service. This means that single title, high price subscriptions are going to be difficult for all but the strongest brands. So of course publishers are looking at different strategies. But then we can also think about how this looks from the point of view of the audience. So what we find is that many more people are now seeing paywalls than a few years ago. For example, 70% of our Norwegian sample said they'd clicked on a link in the last week and are expecting to see a new story, but instead they were asked to pay. This is the highest figure in our sample of all different countries, but even in the US, it's 50%. And there is, of course, a worry that this will increase friction around news. It could put people off, particularly those who are not from this slightly elite group that I talked about earlier, people who have low levels of interest in the news, or perhaps simply can't afford to pay. There is some understanding that news organizations do need to charge for content, but there's also an understanding that there are different options available. So the Guardian's model in particular, where news is free at the point of consumption, but people, if they want to, can pay a membership fee. We talk about this every year, smartphones, but this is because they just get more and more and more important for digital news consumption. This chart illustrates that quite nicely. So now 66% of people across our 38 countries say that they access news via a smartphone in the last week. And you can see how it's grown since 2013. So just to take the UK as an example, around 25% of people said they did this in 2013, and the figure is now 63%. But it's not just these raw numbers, it's also dependence that people have on these devices. So in the UK, the smartphone is now the most important device for first contact with news in the morning. So where do people go first for their news in the morning? And that now most people, not most people, but the single most popular option is the smartphone. So 28% of people say they do this now. It's overtaken TV, and the figure was just 16% 3 years ago. And of course, with under 35s, the figure is even higher. So over half now say that their first contact with news in the morning is via their smartphone. And linked to this, something we've seen grow in the last few years are the mobile aggregators, so services like Apple News and Update, which come built into people's phones when they buy them. Sorry, just to go back, 27% of iPhone owners in the US now say they use Apple News on a weekly basis. And this is a higher figure actually than for any single news source in the US. It's hard to dig deeper into this in a survey because often people don't actually know if they're using Apple News because it's so seamlessly integrated into people's devices. But when people do recognize it, people tend to have a positive view in the same way that they do when it comes to any other form of aggregation. They like having single sources in one place, and we think this is something that's going to grow in the future. Another big trend that we talked about last year, and we've done more research on this year, is the move to more private messaging and more private groups on social media. This is a chart that we also had last year, but we've extended it. So at the overall level, we can see that when it comes to using social networks for any purpose, the lines for Facebook and Twitter have been pretty much flat since 2014. But if you look at how quickly WhatsApp and also Instagram, so this is the dark green and the purple bars, how quickly they've grown since 2014. And this is, to some extent, translated into news use on these networks. So in Facebook has declined in popularity since 2016, in part because they've changed their approach to news slightly. But you can also see that WhatsApp and Instagram have grown for news since 2014. And we think this is part of a shift towards more private spaces and less open networks. We also asked people whether they think the amount of time they spend on each network has changed, and we can see a similar story. So these are figures from the UK, but people in general think they're spending less time with Facebook and more time with WhatsApp and with Instagram. Snapchat has also declined quite significantly. Looking globally, it's really interesting to see how WhatsApp is used differently in different parts of the world. In particular, the comparison between the south and the north of the globe. So just 4% of people in the US say that they use WhatsApp for news, but the figure is around 50% in Brazil, South Africa, Malaysia, and also India, where we did some separate research earlier in the year. And in these countries, WhatsApp is sometimes more popular than Facebook. But on top of this, people in the south are much more likely than those in the West to say they're part of WhatsApp groups which contain people they don't know personally. And this may help explain why in countries like India and also in Brazil, there have been widespread stories about misinformation circulating via WhatsApp. So people in these countries are using it in a very different way than how we use it in the West. When it comes to global concern about what is real and what is fake on the internet when it comes to news, we can see concern becoming more widespread in a lot of different countries. So not just in places like Brazil, but also in the UK, where the figure increased by 12 percentage points compared to last year, up to 70% now, and I've highlighted that in orange on the chart. And this is perhaps a little bit surprising because there isn't, at least as far as we know, a huge fake news problem in the UK, but there has been a lot of media coverage and also a significant government intervention in the UK in the last year, and this may help explain why concern has risen so much. Either way, concern does appear to be having an impact upon people's behaviour. So 26% of people now say that they're relying on more reputable news sources. The figure is 40%. In the US. It's important to point out that we leave it up to people themselves to define what they consider reputable, but when we follow this up in the qualitative interviews, we tend to see that this normally relates to track record and a history of providing reliable news. The flip side of this is that a similar number of people say that they've stopped relying on news sources with a less accurate reputation. Again, this is up to the respondents themselves to define, but it's also important to keep in mind that this is not something that everyone is doing. For the time being, at least, it's something that the more educated and younger people say that they're doing. So turning now to trust more generally, we are now fairly confident that we're seeing declines in trust in many different countries. I think that should be okay. Even in countries like Finland and Germany, which have historically very high levels of trust in the news media, we are seeing now year-on-year declines. Some of this is to do with the news media themselves, but it can also be to do with political events. So we think there might have been a slight increase in the drop related to Brexit in the UK in 2016. And this year we've seen a very significant drop of 11 percentage points in trust in France. France is now one of the countries with the lowest news trust scores in our sample. And we think this probably has something to do with traditional media coming under attack in response to the Yellow Vest protests. And news media here have been accused variously of not representing their views, not understanding them, being too close to government, and so on. And in some countries we can see partisan websites and state-backed media stepping into this vacuum, if you like. On the right, I'm showing the levels of trust scores for individual brands in France, and you can see that the TV brands like the public broadcaster and also BFM TV have really taken a hit to their trust score this year. For the first time, we wanted to try and understand the impact of the rise of populism in Europe at a deeper level and try to link that to news media use. In order to do this, we followed academic work and tried to identify those people in our sample with populist attitudes based on agreement with the belief in a bad elite, a virtuous people, and the idea that political decisions should be taken that follow the will of the people. In a way, this is a simplistic model, and of course there are lots of different ways of defining populism, but this does give us a rough idea of how people with populist attitudes behave when it comes to news media. So what we see is that people with populist attitudes tend to be more widespread in southern and eastern European countries, and less so in northern Europe, particularly in the Nordic countries. And then we've used this data to combine with media use, so we see that people with populist attitudes are more likely to turn to television news than to online news. They're more likely to consume news from Facebook rather than other social media. When they're there, they share and comment more, and they're, in general, less trusting of the news media as a whole. Another thing that we've tried to do, and we've tried to build on some of our research from 2017, is try to look at those outlets that have a higher share of people with populist attitudes than in the general population. So what we've done, we've created some maps. The coloured bubbles here show those outlets with more populist audiences than average, and the grey outlets show with less populist audiences than average. So perhaps unsurprisingly, in the UK, we can see the Mirror is popular with people on the populist left, the Sun with people on the populist right, but also some of the more partisan, politically focused sites like Westminster. And at the other bottom half of the chart, we can see The Guardian, the FT, and The Economist on the left. We have very sort of perhaps elitist audiences rather than populist audiences. And The Telegraph, similar, but on the right. We can apply this to other countries too. So this is the US. There's a slightly different pattern here. As we've seen before, many outlets in the US have audiences that are to the left of the population as a whole. But in general, we don't see as much variation in terms of populism. There are some populist outlets, such as Fox and Breitbart, at least in the sense they have populist audiences, but very little on the non-populist right in the US. In Germany, we see that the outlets, their audiences at least, are much more similar to one another, and therefore much more clustered around the centre. There are some outlets with populist right audiences like Bild and Junge Freiheit, but in general things are much closer together, and this reflects a common criticism made of the German media that they're perhaps too centrist and too close to political elites. Spain is interesting because it's one of the few countries in our sample that has more outlets with populist left audiences than populist right audiences, which perhaps reflects something about the recent political history in Spain. And in Sweden, we see a picture that's similar to Germany. However, we've also seen this space open up on the populist right that's been taken by a number of new online-only outlets that tend to have a focus on immigration. What does all this tell us? Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, I think that it raises questions about how well the media is doing about responding to the range of different attitudes that people can have, but there's also a question of whether they should actually be responding to some of these attitudes and how far in that direction they should go. But it's also a reminder that, at least we can see from the size of the bubbles, that the traditional news outlets are still the largest and still have the most influence in most cases. So how is the news media doing when it comes to more specific aspects of their performance? This year we asked a number of questions to try and assess this. And what we find is relatively high levels of satisfaction with the news media when it comes to keeping people up to date. So 62% of people think that the news media does a good job in this regard. But only 51% of people say that the news media does a good job in explaining or helping people understand the news media. So it feels like there's perhaps a gap here in terms of the expectations and the delivery in terms of what the news media is providing. On top of this, 39% of people say that they think the news media is often too negative. 28% say that they feel they're worn out by the amount of news that's available these days. And 32% say they at least sometimes actively try to avoid the news. And when we ask people why this is, we tend to see the same reasons. So often people say it brings down their mood, and they often feel powerless to change things. And I think this ties in together with the general idea around negativity. When we look at different countries, the largest increase in news avoidance of any country was in the UK. It rose 7 percentage points compared to 2017, and there was a very clear reason why. When we asked people a follow-up question, 71% of people said that they were deliberately trying to avoid news about Brexit. The reason I mention this is just simply because sometimes people avoid the news, it seems, not because of anything the news media is necessarily doing, but because of wider political events and the nature of what's happening. So it's not necessarily something that news organisations can respond to. But we are also seeing, at least in the UK, a proliferation of new news organisations that in some sense are trying to respond to some of these concerns. So in particular, Tortoise are looking at, well, their slogan is slow down and wise up, so they're part of the sort of slow news movement, and this is something we'll track in years to come. Finally, I just want to say a few things about audio, because it's one of the hottest topics in the media today, and a lot of the trends I've just talked about, the rise of audio is in some sense a response to these. So looking at podcasts first, we find that 36% of people now say they listen to a podcast at least once a month, and 15% of people say they listen to a podcast that's specifically about news. And it's against this background that we've seen a number of different publishers, like The Guardian, The Washington Post, and also Politica in Denmark, start their own daily news podcasts. And it's clear that the vast majority of users of these podcasts are from the young. So the New York Times recently claimed that their podcast daily has 10 million monthly listeners that are under 30. And our data also shows that under 35s are twice as likely to listen to news-related podcasts than the over 35s. And this is fairly clear when we look at the devices people say they use to access podcasts. So it's very, very heavily dominated again by the smartphone. We asked about podcasts in our in-depth interviews, and really three key reasons emerge for why people like using them. The first is that they're particularly good for multitasking, so you can listen to podcasts while you're doing other things. It kind of washes over you, there's very little effort. There's a lot of control, you decide what you want to listen to. And there's also, and I think this is quite an important point, there's a greater range of diversity and a less formal tone in a lot of cases to covering the news, and I think this particularly appeals to younger people. We've also been tracking the growth of smart speakers. So this is the growth of ownership of smart speakers in the US and the UK, and you can see very strong growth since 2017 in these two countries. And now, as these devices become more widely available in other countries, they're starting to catch up too. So Australia, Canada, Austria, approaching similar levels of ownership now, but perhaps interestingly, they're not really being used for news that much. So only about a third of people who own these devices say they use them to access news specifically, and if anything, the sort of relative proportion that are accessing news is going down as these devices become more popular. So people are tending to use them to listen to music, live radio, and sort of mundane things like setting alarms and so on. So I'm going to leave it there. These are the main findings from this year's report. And just to leave you with a few sort of questions that I think emerge from these findings. So is it going to be possible for news organizations to build on this desire for more reputable news sources? And can that be turned into revenue? Secondly, should publishers respond to the idea that people are becoming worn out by the amount of news and they're concerned about the amount of negativity in news coverage? Thirdly, how much further can subscription pay models go? Is there an opportunity for bundled content, or does the pricing structure need to change to be able to appeal more widely? Fourthly, what are the implications of the move to more private messaging spaces and less transparent messaging? And finally, are podcasts going to benefit publishers, or is it going to be another false dawn? I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. That's the website. You can download a full copy of the report there. Thank you very much.